All right, Revelations chapter 12, that's where we're at tonight. You know, you almost have to go back a month ago before you come back to a Revelation sermon that we had on Thursday night. There's been so much that's happened on Thursday nights since we had our last, we actually finished up the 11th chapter. We introduced the 7th trumpet. We talked about what that ensues. We're right here at the end of the first half of we're at the last half of the second half of the tribulation. We're literally at the end of the tribulation, right here with the 7th trumpet. It's only a matter of, at the most, a few weeks while these 7 bowls are going to be poured out. It's going to be a really quick thing once we get to them. But we're not even going to get to them until chapter 15. So we have chapter 12 and 13 and 14. We have these 3 chapters that's kind of a little bit of a story to let us know from Satan's viewpoint what's going on during these 7 years. We've been hearing for the first 11 chapters what's going on in heaven. We've been hearing what's going on with God. We understand what God is doing. He's taking back his creation. We understand what the tribulation is all about, what this punishment for the world is all about. But now we're going to take 3 chapters and we're going to kind of look at it from Satan's point of view. We're going to look at it from the earth's point of view, what Satan's been doing for these 7 years. And what he is. And we're going to start out right off the bat tonight, going all the way back to even before creation. So John is going to really take us on a little bit of a ride tonight. So we're not going to get too far into chapter 12, but we're only going to tackle the first 6 verses tonight because I want to kind of take our time and go through it. But yeah, it was about a month ago since the last time we finished chapter 11. My dad had his little thing that he had. He don't want to call it anything, and so I'll respect him and not call it anything. We'll just say, you know, I needed to go visit my dad, which was probably the most important thing I needed to do outside of getting a permit. But I had a lot of fun, and I was there that Thursday night, and we live streamed. So I don't know how many of you actually tuned in and actually saw the live stream and got to hear Dad, because he actually was with me to start. He prayed, and he's still got a good, strong voice. And I think Mom might have even said hi on there too, didn't? Yeah. I think I got Mom to come around, and she didn't want to either, because you know what, nothing was made up or anything. And you got to know my mom going to church. And even though it was just a live stream from their dining room, she felt like we were in church. So you know, so I imagine how she felt. But no, I had a good time. And then of course we had the week before the concert, and we didn't even have a service that Thursday night. And then last Thursday night, there was no one here. So you know, there you go. Nikki and Logan showed up to get the pallets, and so we loaded the pallets up. So, and we had a good time, and we just enjoyed ourselves. But that's what happened. So that's okay. So that's the last 3 Thursdays. So y'all ready to get back to it?
Yeah.
Revelations chapter 12. Let's read the first 6 verses. A great sign appeared in heaven. A woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. And she was with child, and she cried out, being in labor and in pain to give birth. Then another sign appeared in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his heads were 7 diadems, which are like crowns. And his tail swept away a third of the stars of the heaven and threw them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she gave birth, he might devour her child. And she gave birth to a son, a male child, who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron, and her child was caught up to God and to his throne. Then the woman fled into the wilderness, where she had a place prepared by God, so that there she would be nourished for 1,260 days. Now we've heard that phrase used a few times already in the book of Revelations. This 1,260 days. If you divide that up, that's 3.5 years. And so that's how we know that this is the great tribulation, this 3.5 years. And so we know about that. So the war of the ages is about to happen right here. That's what the 7th trumpet is issuing in. The culmination of the war of the ages. This truly is the real Star Wars right here. Recorded it right here in Revelation. Because this is about Satan and God. And who will rule. And Satan feels like God has never given him, Satan, a fair shake, nor any of his creation. Because he felt like God is pompous, and God is proud, and God is overbearing, and God can make you do whatever it is that he wants you to do. And Satan doesn't like that. We're going to read a few scriptures tonight about Satan when we get to his part. Notice that there are some characters here, right? There's at least, there's about 6 main characters over these next 3 chapters that we're going to be in, 12 and 13 and 14. Because like I said, the actual events of the 7th trumpet, they're not even revealed until chapter 15. But we have these 3 chapters in the meantime, and they're going to take us through world history all the way since before the creation, all the way to actually the future that we haven't even experienced yet. These next 3 chapters are going to do that, all right? And so there are a number of these main characters. They play a very important part in these 3 chapters. In fact, there's at least 6 of them, and there might even be a 7th, but there are for certain 6. And so I want you to note that. So tonight we're only going to get to 3, okay, if we can, and I'm pretty sure we will. The first is a woman, and that was in the 1st and 2nd verse. And the second is the dragon, and that's in verse 3 and 4. And then the third is the male child, all right? And that's in verses 5 and 6. And then after that, we're going to hear about Michael. He's the 4th important character. We're going to hear about the beast from the sea, and he's an important character. We're going to hear about the beast from the earth, and he's an important character. And then a 7th that could be identified would be the saved remnant of Israel. So, but for sure, these 6 we're going to talk about, and you could probably put the remnant in there as a 7th. So tonight, as I said, we're just going to get to these first 3, and we're going to do these a pretty quick manner because there's a lot to know about these 3 characters. And the first is the woman, all right? Verse 1, what does verse 1 say? A great sign appeared in heaven. Now, where there's a sign, it's God's affirmation that this is to be taken literally, okay? Now, what he also means, though, is that this is a symbol. So it's not a literal woman, okay? Sean, when you were when you were overseas, I know you can probably relate to this. If you went into an outlying area and the American flag was flying, what did people think? See, they knew that America was here. They knew that American force was here, American protection is here, America's here to carry out the mission that America says. But that flag is nothing but a flag. It's a sign. It's a symbol, right? But it symbolizes our nation. When you cross over from South Carolina into North Carolina and you see a sign that says, "Welcome to North Carolina." Well, the sign isn't North Carolina. You don't climb up on the sign and say, "Hey, I'm in North Carolina." The sign is just simply a symbol of the land that you're entering into, North Carolina. This woman is the same thing. It's just a symbol. She's not a literal woman. So we need to find out who she is, right? Now notice the word great here, a great sign. So that's kind of important too, because this word great is mega. Mega, you know, we get that from like something large, right? Something big, something great, right? And so when he means great, he literally means large, something bigger than life. This mega sign. Here is this sign, se imeion in the Greek, is what it is for sign. It means a symbol that points to some kind of reality. So when you see this woman appearing in heaven, the woman is to illustrate a symbol, but not to be a literal woman. She's a symbolic of some other reality. So, and she's not the first symbolic woman that's mentioned in Revelations either. There are actually 4. And we've already saw one. And it was back in chapter 2. And it was about Jezebel. You remember? The church that allowed Jezebel to be in charge of the church. Well, it wasn't actually Jezebel. See? And we knew that. But what did Jezebel stand for? Jezebel stood for paganism and sin. And she was leading the church to be paganistic, to worship idols. That's what she was doing. And it was really painful to Jesus Christ to watch the church go away from what it had been taught into this paganistic society by Jezebel. And remember, he cursed her pretty badly. But that was the first representative woman. This is the second, all right? And now there's a third that we're going to see in chapter 17. Revelation chapter 17. It's called a scarlet woman. And this scarlet woman, she is a whore or a harlot. and she represents the apostate church. Now, when we get to Revelation 17, we'll study about her, but that's what she represents. And then there's the fourth woman that appears in chapter 19, and she is the wife of the Lamb. Now, who do you suppose that represents? We're going to be in heaven during the tribulation, having this marriage supper of the Lamb. So who is the Lamb's bride? The church. Very good. So the wife of the Lamb is who she's called in chapter 19, this woman. That's the church. That's us, representative of the church. So you have the apostate church. She's the harlot. She wants to be the wife, but she can't be because she has sin in her life. And then we have this Jezebel. She was teaching this apostate. Now we have this woman. Now who is this woman? Okay? Who is this woman? Well, I think we figured out in the first verse where it says what she's clothed with. She's got some clothes on. And what is she clothed with?
Sun.
The sun and the moon, and under her feet and on her head a crown of 12 stars. Now where have we heard, Lucas, a story about the sun and the moon and 11 stars? Do you remember that? Let's turn to Genesis chapter 37. I know we learned that this year, but it's kind of an obscure thing. But when I read it, you'll remember it. Genesis chapter 37. You remember Joseph? Joseph had these dreams. And he dreamed about, he was a sheaf, like this big leaf, and that there were 11 other sheaves in front of him, and they all bowed down to his sheaf. So now they were all sheaves, but his sheaf stood up, and the other 11 bowed to them. The brothers didn't take too kindly to that, did they? Like that. Then he had this other dream, and this is found in Genesis chapter 37, and I think we're going to start reading about in verse 9. Genesis 37, 9. Now he had still another dream, and related it to his brothers, and he said, Lo, I have... I just love the way... Can you imagine Joseph saying to his brothers, Lo, I have had another dream. Is that the way you talk to your sisters? Yeah, pretty sure not. Listen up, y'all, right? That's what that LO stands for, listen up. I have had still another dream, and behold, the sun and the moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me. He related it to his father and to his brothers, and his father rebuked him and said to him, What is this dream that you have had? Shall I and your mother and your brothers actually come to bow ourselves down before you to the ground? His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the saying in mind. So what was Joseph saying? He's a star, like his brothers were. They're 11 stars, so they're 12 stars. And the father, Israel, Jacob's name was later changed to Israel, was the sun, and his wives were the moon, right? So he's like, here we are, the sun, the moon, and the 12 stars. Found here again in Revelations. The key sign to let you know who this woman is. This woman is Israel. It's the nation of Israel. Just obvious that that's who it has to be. And she was with child, and she cried out, being in labor and in pain to give birth. Now, I don't think it's any mystery when we get down to verse 5 that this birth to a son, the male child, is Jesus Christ. I mean, you can just read that passage and know that that's Jesus. So we already know, what was Jesus? See, he was a Jew. He was a Jew. Now, he was the Son of God also, so he was all God, but he was all man too. He came from the womb of Mary, and Mary was a true descendant of David. She had to be a descendant of David. In fact, Joseph, which has no blood at all and related to his son, Jesus, also was a descendant of David. Even though he doesn't have anything to play in this, Mary does. But Joseph still was a literal descendant of David. And what's really interesting is that Joseph comes from the line of David that is cursed. There's a cursed line of David. And that was from Nathan, the son Nathan, which was one of David's sons. And it wasn't Nathan, but I believe it was his grandson or great-grandson committed some sin, and that line was cursed. So Joseph comes from the cursed line. Mary comes from the pure line, which her line goes David, and who was next? Come on, who was David's son that the line came through? Hello? Come on, you guys know this. Solomon? Solomon. He was king after David. And that's the line that Jesus came through. Mary, her great-grandfather of 1,000 times was Solomon, whereas Joseph's was Nathan. But they both have David as their father, okay? Different kids, but yet the line came through the same, right? All right, so we know that's who the child is, but so we want to understand in verses 1 and 2 that this is Israel and the nation of Israel, right? Certainly, if you think about it, Israel, the woman that's being portrayed here, she's a lot like Joseph. Was Joseph not sold into slavery? He was sold to the Gentiles, and Israel also spent 400 years enslaved in captivity, buried among the nations, and yet they became prominent, they were preserved, they were delivered, they were saved, they were given authority, and they were given a kingdom. And that's exactly what happened in Joseph's life. Exactly what happened. He was enslaved, and then he was given a prominent position. He was all the way up to second in command as the Pharaoh. He was given a kingdom. So Joseph is like that type of Israel, right? And that's what Israel was. Do you know that this child that we're going to talk about was also promised all the way back in Genesis 3:15, where it says that he will bruise the serpent will bruise his head, and the child will bruise his heel. Or no, the serpent will bruise his heel, and the child will crush his head, and that's how that works. So Satan will bruise Jesus, which he does, beats him up pretty badly, but Jesus still gets the final and crushing his head. That's promised to us in Genesis 3:15. So that's what it means, being in labor and in pain to give birth. All right? Now verse 3 and 4. So now there's another sign that appeared in heaven. And behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his heads were 7 diadems, and his tail swept away 1/3 of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. All right, so we can tell by these metaphors that are used here that this dragon has to be Satan. It's the only person that drug 1/3 of the angels out of heaven and cast them to earth with him. That's what this means. It doesn't mean literal like it did earlier where it said 1/3 of the stars, fell from the sky. This is Satan he was the morning star. He was one of the key stars. Now he takes 1/3 of the stars with him. Now how many angels are there? We know that there's twice as many that God has than Satan has. That's the most important fact you need to remember. God has twice as many angels as Satan does. But there are a lot, because we just read here a couple of chapters ago, there's 200 million that come right out of the Euphrates River. 200 million demons. So that's 200 million right there. And then there's millions more. There's others that are mentioned, and we don't even know what the total is. But that just means there's got to be at least 1 billion or more, 1 billion plus of God's angels to take care of God's work. But I just want you to know that. Now, before we get into these 7 heads and 10 horns, let's look at where they're mentioned later on, because they're mentioned later on, and we're going to study them later on. We're not going to study them tonight. We'd never get through the thing tonight if we studied this. But Revelation chapter 17, look at Revelation chapter 17, and let's look at verse 9, because I don't want to just leave you hanging on this, okay? Revelation 17:9 says, "Here is the mind which has wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits." Now this woman, by the way, is a different woman than Israel. That's not the woman. This is the harlot. Remember I told you there's another one? Well, this is the harlot woman here. This is Babylon. She's mentioned as Babylon here. But this is the harlot woman. And they are 7 kings. 5 have fallen. 1 is, and the other has not yet come. And when he comes, he must remain a little while. And the beast which was and is not is himself also an 8th, and is one of the 7, and he goes to destruction. So, this is where Revelation gets confusing to a lot of people, because a lot of people read that and go, yeah, that makes absolutely no sense at all. But you know what's really going to be interesting, and you're going to find this really interesting? When we get to the 17th chapter, this is going to be made very clear as to who these people are. And so you're looking forward to that. It's going to be awesome, right? That's going to be a good time, and we're going to learn who these guys are. Now, what about, what's the other thing, too? It talks about the 7, let's see, so the 7 kings. These 7 kings represent 7 worldly kingdoms. I mean, that's what we see right here, right? And then it also says that he has 10 horns. Well, you know, horns represent strength and power, right? Animals' horns are even used as weapons, right? So that's what they're usually used for in this metaphor. So it's indications of power and strength. And we also see them in Revelation 17. If you keep reading verse 12, Revelation 17:12, the 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received a kingdom, but they receive authority as kings with the beast for 1 hour. These have one purpose, and they give their power and authority to the beast. All right? So we're going to learn a lot more about these beasts, or about the beast, about the kings, and about these horns when we get to Revelation chapter 17, right? I do want you to look at Daniel chapter 7, though, just so that you see how the Old Testament and the New Testament go together. So Daniel's back in the Old Testament. It's one of the larger of the, I think it's after Isaiah, Ezekiel, and then Daniel. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, kind of somewhere in that neighborhood. Daniel, and look at the 7th chapter, Daniel chapter 7. It talks a lot about these same things. Daniel had this exact same vision. I just want you to see that the visions are the same, so that people that study the book of Daniel, and we need to do that at some point. Hopefully God will give me grace enough we can get through some of this Old Testament prophecy. But this is the Old Testament prophecy that Daniel had. In chapter 7, and in verse 7, it says, after this, I kept looking in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrifying and extremely strong, and it had large iron teeth. And it devoured and crushed and trampled down the remainder with its feet. And it was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. So this is that same beast that's talked about in Revelation. Look down at, let's see, I think it's verse 20. Yeah, verse 20 says, and the meaning of the 10 horns that were on its head, and the other horn which came up, and before which 3 of them fell, namely that horn which had eyes and a mouth, uttering great boasts, which was larger in appearance than its associates. And I kept looking, and that horn was waging war with the saints and overpowering them, until the Ancient of Days came, and judgment was passed in favor of the saints of the highest one, and the time arrived when the saints took possession of the kingdom. So you see already, Daniel is going to help explain a lot of what we're going to see in Revelations when we get to that point, right? And then, let's see what else. Yeah. All right, so like I say, we're going to get to that when we get to that chapter, but I'm just going to suffice it at that. So that's what it's talking about here when it talks about the red dragon, which is Satan, and these horns, and these 7 heads, and these 7 diadems. And like I said, we're gonna explain all that when we get a little bit further on. But I want you to understand his tail swept away 1/3 of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. And this, of course, is about his fall. Now, I want you to understand that there's a lot of interweaving between evil people and Satan himself, okay? Look at 1 John. 1 John is right before Revelations. Like Jude is a little book right before it. And then 1st, 2nd, 3rd John are the ones before it. Look at 1 John. We just studied this on our communion night, not too long ago, really. But I want to remind you of it again. 1 John chapter 3. And this was, we were talking about loving one another. And John mentions this about Cain. 1 John chapter 3 and verse 10, or 12 says this. Not as Cain, who was of the evil one, and slew his brother. And for what reason did he slay him? Because his deeds were evil, and his brothers were righteous. John tucks a little bit of truth in that we don't even see in Genesis. We don't even see in the Genesis story. He said he was of the evil one, literally associating Satan with Cain together. Do you realize that what is this red dragon trying to do? He's trying to stop the child. And he's going to stop the child at whatever cost. He stops the child. Now, who was Adam's firstborn son? Seriously? Adam and Eve, their first son was named? Well, it's the other one.
It's 50-50.
Cain. Cain's the oldest. That's the firstborn son, Cain. Eve says, I had a child from God. I'm blessed of God, and I'm going to call him Cain. Then she had another son, and she called him Abel. She had a third son. You get extra credit for this. Anybody know what the third one is? That's where the line of Christ actually comes to, the third one. Why? Because Abel's dead and Cain's evil, right? He's of the evil one. So it had to be the third one, and his name is Seth. Okay. All right.
I remember that.
There you go. All right, Cain, Abel, and Seth, right? Cain and Abel, but everybody knows the story, Cain and Abel. So that's it. But he's the firstborn. That's where the line was supposed to come through. That's the promise that Eve thought. Eve thought, now I have a son. This is the promised one. In fact, she was thinking this might even be the one that crushes the head of the serpent. She don't know any better. That's what God promised her in Genesis 3:15. They're looking forward to the Messiah. I mean, all the way to Eve. She's already looking for the Redeemer to come. You get it? And what does Satan do? Enters Cain's heart, gets rid of the firstborn. Got rid of him. Can't come. I'm killing the second one. So there you are. Now we're back to square one. We have to have another, Seth. And the line follows through Seth. That's what he tried to do all the time, right? He's always trying to wipe people out. But I wanted you to see that in 1 John so that when you see Isaiah, now when you turn back to the big book of Isaiah in the Old Testament and look at chapter 14, Isaiah chapter 14, this will tell you a little bit. It's speaking of a king, an earthly king. Let me get to it and I'll show it to you. Isaiah chapter 14. So it's talking about one of the oppressors of Israel, but when you read this scripture, you know that it's really talking about Satan himself. Isaiah chapter 14, start reading in verse 12. Isaiah is given this vision from God, and he writes these words, "How you have fallen from heaven, O star of the morning, son of the dawn." Who are we talking about here? Satan. Yeah, he was the star of the morning. "You have been cut down to the earth, you who have weakened the nations. But you said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven. I will raise my throne above the stars of God." That's what Satan said. I'll be greater than God because I know better than he does. I'll treat people right. I'll let people do what they want to do. I'm not going to tell them what they have to do. "And I will sit on the mount of assembly in the recesses of the north. And I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. And I will make myself like the Most High." That's Satan, right? So that's no earthly king now. Look at Ezekiel, Isaiah, so you keep Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel. Ezekiel chapter 28. Turn to that one. This is about the king of Tyre. Ezekiel chapter 28. It's talking about the king of Tyre. But then we know that he also was consumed by Satan himself. Satan used the king of Tyre to do exactly what he wanted done. And what does it say in verse 11? Ezekiel 28, verse 11 says, "Again, the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, take up a lamentation over the king of Tyre, and say to him, Thus says the Lord God, you had the seal of perfection." Satan was created in perfection. If you guys remember, we used this verses when we did a little Sunday night study on evil. And where did evil come from? Did God create evil? No. Very good, McKenna. I'm glad that you know that so adamantly, because he did not. He created perfection. When Satan was created, he was perfect. He had no sin. "You were in Eden," verse 13, "the garden of God. Every precious stone was your covering, the ruby, the topaz, and the diamond, the beryl, the onyx, and the jasper, the lapis lazuli, the turquoise, and the emerald, and the gold. The workmanship of your settings and sockets was in you. On the day that you were created, they were prepared. You were the anointed cherub who covers, and I placed you there. You were on the holy mountain of God. You walked in the midst of the stones of fire. You were blameless in your ways from the day you were created." Where did evil come from? The next verse helps us understand. "Until unrighteousness was found in you." Where did it come from? What's it say next? By the abundance of your trade, you were internally filled with violence, and you sinned. Therefore, I have cast you as profane from the mountain of God, and I have destroyed you, O covering cherub, from the midst of the stones of fire. And it goes on to talk a lot more about it, saying, but you see, that's where evil came from. Something inside this perfect creature changed internally. And guess what? He took a third of them with him. So there were a lot of the others that felt the same way that he did. And that's Satan, of course. Now, you know, Satan he's done everything that he can to wipe out the Jews, okay? He's done this from the beginning of time. We saw it with Cain, right? Tried to get rid of Abel. We saw it in the story of Moses. If you read Exodus chapter 1 and 2, I was going to use some of them, Logan, but I think I'm just going to briefly just give you the story. Most of us know the story of Moses. Moses shouldn't have even been alive. The edict was that Pharaoh said all the male children needed to die. Now, why was that? That's just straight from Satan himself, wasn't it? Yep. This Pharaoh did not know anything about Joseph. That's what it says. And Satan had entered his heart and said, we're going to kill them all. Now, if you can understand this about Pharaoh, then now you can understand this whole idea about God's sovereignty. Because, see, that's why God caused 10 plagues to come upon Pharaoh. And even though Pharaoh wanted to let the children go, God hardened his heart so he wouldn't let them go, even because he said he didn't want to. But it's because this man was full of Satan himself. He literally wanted to get rid of the Jews. Satan needed to stop this promise. And Satan also knew that Abraham was promised that they would go into captivity for 430 years. Satan's counted the days. Well, here it is. 80 years from now, someone is going to be born and raise up and lead these people out of here. And so he starts now killing the boys. Let's kill the boys. And so what does Pharaoh do? Well, first off, he gets these women, the midwives, to say, hey, you get to the boy, you get to these women, and if they have a boy, you kill it. Just make sure that it does, you know. And hey, for a child to die in childbirth back then was really not even that unusual. Okay, it really wasn't. It happened a lot. It certainly wasn't a majority of the time, but it certainly also was. It happened. And so he's like, just make sure they die. Well, these midwives thought, well, that's just cruel. Okay, we've always just trusted God. Whatever, you know, the baby lives. If it don't, that's, you know, God's will. But we're not killing these babies. So they just couldn't bring themselves to do it. And so Pharaoh realizes that all these boys are still being born. He calls these midwives and it's like, what is going on? He says, man, these Israeli women, man, they are tough. They're tough little cookies. They have this baby before we can even get there. All right? So what are we going to do after they get there? The baby's already crying. It's alive. You know, can't kill it then, right? I mean, that would be, you know, that would look bad, right? So then what does Pharaoh do? Well, he says, you know, I'm just going to make an edict in the whole land. If you have a boy, you drown it. You drown it. And what does Moses' parents do? The Holy Spirit intervenes and says, this child is special. And she builds a little basket, puts him in a thing. We know the story. Pharaoh's daughter comes down. Here's the baby crying. Satan's whole plan to destroy God's purpose was all crushed by just a little baby's crying. And her heart was tender. And she raised him up. And God saved him, right? He's done everything they can. He tried to destroy Jacob. He tried to kill the line of Judah. He tried to take Israel captive. He eliminated 10 tribes and when they divided the kingdom. If you guys don't remember that, he took the captives from the north. They never returned. But do you know that representatives from all 10 tribes filtered into the south so that all 12 tribes were still intact? The arch enemy, Satan of Israel, tried to destroy the Jews through pagan kings, and God used judges to deliver them, didn't he? See? They were always trying to do something wrong, but God always found a way to bring them back. Did you know that this great dragon, he tried to get Saul to murder David, did he not? Saul threw a spear at David, and I bet you Saul was a pretty good spear thrower, and it missed David. And he did that on more than one occasion. On more than one occasion, he could have took David's life, and that would have ended the messianic line. Couldn't do it. God wasn't allowing it, was he? Haman became Satan's tool to attempt genocide. Remember that when we read the book of Esther? And yet Esther still saved the Jews, and Haman was executed by his own gallows. Now let's go back to Revelation chapter 12 and look at verse 4. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she gave birth, he might devour her child. This Greek word devour means exactly what it means. Eat it up. It's like a dragon eating a young child. And that's exactly what he wants to try to do. Look at Matthew chapter 2. Let's look at Matthew chapter 2 really quickly. Verse 13. Matthew chapter 2. We all should know that that's got to be about the birth of Christ. And it is. The child's going to be born. And what happens in the 13th verse? I think you've all heard this Christmas story. When they had gone, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to destroy him." Not Herod. It's the devil, isn't it? Yep. The dragon is looking to devour the child the moment that it was born. Verse 14, Joseph got up, took the child and his mother, and while it was still night, they left for Egypt, and he remained there until the death of Herod. And this was to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet, "Out of Egypt I have called my son." Then when Herod saw that he had been tricked by the Magi, he became enraged and sent and slew all the male children who were in Bethlehem and all its vicinity from 2 years and under, according to the time with which he had determined from the Magi. Is this not just the devil himself? What possesses a man to want to go kill 2-year-olds and below just because they happen to be a male child? And he's been told this might be the Messiah. This is the devil himself. No man has that little compassion, surely. But the devil had none. And he wanted to make sure that it got done. But God also made sure that the child lived, didn't he? So look down in verse 19. But when Herod died, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother and go into the land of Israel, for those who sought the child's life are dead." So Joseph got up, took the child and his mother, and came into the land of Israel. And when he heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. And then after being warned by God in a dream, he left for the regions of Galilee and came and lived in a city called Nazareth. And this was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophets. He shall be called a Nazarene. Do you all remember the Pharisees when they knew that Jesus was from Nazareth? See, that's where they thought he was from. Because he was little when they came there. So they just figured that's probably where he was born. And they said he's from, and what did they say? No prophet comes out of Nazareth. See why God picked that town? See, because you'd never suspect that the Messiah is going to come through Nazareth. He wouldn't have. He should have been in Judea. Should have come from Bethlehem. In fact, that's what they said. He's going to be born in Bethlehem. This guy wasn't born in Bethlehem. He was born in Nazareth. But now we know the rest of the story, don't we? Kind of that kind of a thing. And so that's what he's been doing, man. Look at Luke chapter 4 real quick. We just want to look at one other example, just how Satan continually tried to take Jesus' life. Look at Luke chapter 4 and look at verse 28. And all the people in the synagogue were filled with rage as they heard these things. See, Jesus would teach the truth, and they weren't having it. And they got up and they drove him out of the city, and they led him to the brow of the hill on which their city had been built, in order to throw him down the cliff. But passing through their midst, he went his way. How amazing is that? I mean, he literally just went right through them, and they didn't even know it was even him. They're all in this rage to get to this man. It's not his time, right? Jesus said that so many times. It's not my time. Remember when Jesus would send them down to the feast, and he would stay behind? He would always come, and he would always show up, because Jesus honored the feast. But he didn't want to come with the disciples. Why? Because that's what they'd be looking for him. And he knew that they would try to kill him before his time was done. And he knew how bad Satan wanted to kill him. Satan even took him in the wilderness and tempted him. Do you realize that if he could just get him to sin, if I could just get him to sin, it's over. It's over. The whole plan. He tried and he tried and he tried. Do you know that in France and Germany, the Jews were blamed for the Black Plague and they were tortured and killed? Do you know that the same year that Columbus discovered America in 1492, Spain drove every Jew out of the nation? The Roman Catholic Inquisition slaughtered Jews in the name of Jesus Christ, and the numbers of them are beyond counting. They were all massacred in the name of Christ. You know why? Because they killed the Messiah. So they killed the Jews to try to get rid of them. In 1882, the Russians committed atrocities in the massacre of the Jews. In 1894, there was that infamous Dreyfus affair. in an effort to blame Jews for every national problem and to get them out of the ranking places in the military. And then came Hitler. We all know that story. 6 million Jews that were massacred. And if he'd have had his way, he would have destroyed every single one of them. This man was of Satan himself. If I can get rid of the wife of God, none of this can happen. I'm wiping them out. I'm wiping them out. Do you realize that there is not another nationality that through 2,000 years can still trace their ancestry back to a Jewish ancestry but the Jews? No one else can do that. Jews know they're Jews. Jews, any Orthodox Jew marries another Orthodox Jew. That's what they do. As evil and sinful as Howard Stern was, his parents, which were Jewish, and Howard was Jewish, they said, you're going to marry a Jewish girl, or we're not coming to the wedding. And he married a Jewish girl and had children, and they're Jews. And that's how Jews perpetuate themselves through the generations. Now, they don't know what tribe they're from anymore. That's pretty much all wiped out. But God does. And God says he's picking 12,000 from each of the tribes. Here later, we know. God knows. He knows where they come from. But the mere fact that they're Jewish, that they haven't intermarried, the mere fact that they've kept themselves pure, many of them have anyway, it's amazing. And Satan knows that if I can wipe it out, I can wipe it out. And this will never happen. Now we have the Arabs, which given just the slightest provocation would do anything to wipe out Israel. We hear about it every day on the news. And they don't want them there. They don't want them there. They'd love to just get rid of all of them. Just round them all up, send them away. That's Satan, folks. That's Satan's plan. That's Satan's plan from the beginning. It's going to be his plan all the way to the end. And that's what it says here in Revelation 12. He wants to devour the child. Now we come to the Son, verse 5, a male child who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. And her child was caught up to God and to his throne. And like I said, just that verse alone lets you know that this is Jesus Christ that we're talking about. So the nation of Israel did give birth to their Messiah. Mary in particular, also a Jew. And of course, that's what he did. Now, look at verse 6. By the way, you can, if you're keeping notes, or you'll see this on Facebook, Psalms chapter 2 is quoted quite a bit in the whole book of Revelation. And in Psalms chapter 2, verses 7 to 10, which I think I'm going to have Logan go ahead and just put it up. I'm not going to read the whole passage. But you can see where it talks about he's coming and he will rule with a rod of iron. So even David, when he wrote the Psalms, prophesied about who this Jesus was, who this male child was, and what he would do. And then the woman fled into the wilderness where she had a place prepared by God. Remember, this is the second half of the tribulation. We know that they are going, when the second half starts, that's when the Antichrist and the false prophet are going to have this desolation of abomination in the temple. They're going to come in the temple where the Jews have built the temple now, and they've gone back to sacrifices, and they're going back to, they still don't believe in Jesus now. They're still looking forward to a Messiah coming, but they built the temple, they're doing this, and he's claiming to be the Messiah, but they're not receiving him as the Messiah. He comes into the temple, he sets up his own regime, and they flee. They flee Jerusalem because he oppresses them. This starts the second half of the tribulation, and they flee. Look at Matthew chapter 24. We've looked at this a couple times, but I just want you to see that Jesus actually predicted it. Matthew chapter 24. And this is that time where the desolation, what the beast will do in the temple. And it says, let me see if I get my note right here. 24 verse 15. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Whoever is on the housetop must not go down to get the things that are in his house. Whoever is in the field must not turn back to get his cloak. But woe to those who are pregnant and those who are nursing babies in those days. Pray that your flight will not be in the winter or on a Sabbath. For then there will be a great tribulation, such as not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will. Unless those days have been cut short, no life would have been saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. And then it goes on to talk about the rest of it. Look at verse 29. But immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heaven will be shaken. And then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. This is the end of the tribulation, right? And that's what we're talking about here in Revelations. So they will be protected by the Lord for these 3.5 years. Notice that it says, they fled into the wilderness where she had a place prepared by God. So there she would be nourished for 1,260 days. Listen, a guy, John Phillips, he's a great Christian writer. He wrote this. And listen to how apt this is. I love this, so I'm just going to quote from it exactly what he says. Satan, he can't kill the woman. He can't kill the hope of the kingdom. And he can't kill the child. And he said, significantly, the turning point came in Moses' life when he saw in the desert that mysterious burning bush which flamed and blazed away. But for all the crackling of the fire, the bush was not consumed. Despite the ceaseless hatred of her foes, because God is in her midst, Israel cannot be assimilated into the nations, nor can she be exterminated by the nations. She is the burning bush in the wilderness. She burns, but she's never consumed. End quote. I thought that was so aptly put. I'd never really thought of it that way, but that's exactly right. All these Old Testament pictures that we have just show us something about what's going to happen. All right? And that's these three. We'll get to Michael next time, verse 7. All right. Let's bow our heads in prayer.